Well, I think that Lincoln speaks to us as a model of moral integrity and moral clarity and unimpeachable integrity. And also, in addition to all that, and in addition to being an eloquent spokesman for democracy, Lincoln also is a model of psychological maturity. He refused to quarrel, he refused to hold grudges, he refused to be vindictive. And his psychological maturity, I think, is an incredible achievement that I think can inspire all of us, because he had to overcome so much. He overcame abject poverty that he was born into. He overcame the early death of his mother, the early death of his siblings, an unsympathetic father, the loss of 2 of his 4 children before they reached adulthood. He had a very unhappy marriage. He suffered a number of career setbacks. And despite all that, he became a model of psychological balance and wholeness that I think can be an inspiration for people throughout the world. The qualities that I think Lincoln made Lincoln influential included his integrity, his eloquence, his humor, his ability to radiate a kind of wisdom. Even when he was a young man, he was referred to as Old Abe. And old in the positive sense of wisdom and maturity and understanding that even when he was a young man in his 30s, people sensed. So all those things, I think, combined to make him a particularly likable and electable candidate. Well, politics have changed since Mr. Lincoln's time in many ways. In those days, when you campaigned for president, you stayed home. It was considered unseemly, it was considered selfish, it was considered too egotistical to campaign yourself. So you had surrogates represent you. You distributed campaign documents, you had rallies, you had various barbecues and the like. But you yourself were expected to be reticent and modest and not toot your own horn. That was considered too egotistical. So it was a very different scene from the scene we know today. And also, in presidential politics in those days, primaries were not heard of. Primaries were introduced in the 20th century on a large scale. And it's really since 1960 that we've had presidential conventions become coronations rather than real meetings where decisions are made about who should run. So it was a very different scene back in Lincoln's day. Well, when Lincoln campaigned for the state legislature, when he was in his 20s and 30s, it was very informal, it was very personal. He went around to the various farms and shops and would talk to the farmers, and he wouldn't talk politics with them right away. He would ask, well, how's the farm doing? Would you show me your farm and your outbuildings? And, well, tell me about your children. And he would ingratiate himself personally before he would get into a political discussion, whereas many of his opponents would immediately go out and they would start talking politics right away. And so Lincoln's knack for connecting to people and making them convinced that he was their friend and he was a likable fellow was an extremely important element in his success when he aspired to the state legislature here in Central Illinois. The debates between Lincoln and Douglas were, by modern standards, very different from what we're used to. Instead of 2-minute sound bites with journalists posing questions to which you would have to answer in a very limited amount of time, those debates were 3 hours long, and the opening speaker would have an hour, and then the other speaker would have an hour and a half, and then the original speaker would have a half-hour closing. And thousands and tens of thousands would come out to listen to these for 3 hours on end, and sometimes in the hot blazing sun. Later on in the fall, during very bad weather, windy, cold weather. It's astounding. And I'm actually hopeful that the proposal that's been made by one Republican aspirant for the presidency of having Lincoln-Douglas style debates would be actually adopted, because those 3-hour discussions really allowed for a detailed and in-depth examination of the issues. And the modern format that we're used to with 2 or 3 minute answers doesn't permit that.